Good morning, everybody. Very nice to see you. Particularly nice to see such a spread of communities and such a large number of participants. Oh, mic's not on, folks? Oh. Is that better? No? All right. Okay. Okay. If you can't hear, unlike me, it's not because you're deaf. It's because I don't switch things on. Okay. So nice to see so many different communities and also so many residents and participants, clients who obviously are very central to the idea of a process that is a much more participative therapeutic process than many. I'm going to do a number of things today, and I'll tell you about that in a minute, but I first of all want to show you this picture, okay? Because I'm going to talk a little bit about how maybe activities beyond talking make such a significant impact on our lives, and actually how therapeutic environments are particularly good and should become increasingly better at the idea of how do we participate in play as a creative and innovative way of communicating and so on. So this is called Crossing Open Ground. It's by an artist called David Gilbert. And in my sins, now I've retired, I'm also a chair of a trust for his artwork. He's a sculptor. But this picture, for many years, I have a carving of it, a big relief carving, and I have a drawing of it too on my wall, which I've bought over the years. It's the one enduring image that I think has stayed with me all the years that I've, it says most to me about all the years of the work that I've been doing. And it's about, for me, about how we have to stand out as being individuals. We must be ourselves in the end, if we at all can. But we should never lose sight of the fact that we not only depend upon others, so other groups of people, but also that we come from others. That we're never out there only on our own, however difficult our circumstances might be. So crossing open ground is about taking risk and courage to move into a space that's you, but never losing touch with who you are in relation to others, okay? And I think as an image, a symbol, that's a very helpful one for us to kind of hold in mind when we talk about play. So I'm going to do, I now have the technical principle. I've got to watch all this wire, haven't I? I've now got to, I've been told to watch tab and, what was it? Tab and? Alt. Alt and? Oh, yes, no, we're, no, it's that way. Sorry, I'm very bad at this. No, we've now gone out altogether, haven't I? Is that it? Lovely. Thank you very much. The elderly should be good at IT because we have more time, we're told. But actually, I moved over to an Apple system, having used a Microsoft one all my working life, or the latter end of my working life, and actually I'm completely floored. I can't use it half the time, and now I've forgotten how to use PowerPoint. So I'm afraid you'll have to put up with some of the glitches in my thing. I don't apologise for the funny, wobbly sort of animations. That's because I didn't know how to use it. So I ended up getting the first one I could choose, and you don't get them all come up nice and neatly separately, which would help. So don't read the second line on each sheet, okay? Because otherwise you'll just be distracted. So I'd like you to kind of try and stick with what am I going to say? Yeah, just to say here, I'm going to say a little bit about context, something about the what and the why. Okay, I'll explain that later. It sounds a bit curious, but the what and the why. And then something about, at the end, what we might be inquiring into. That's we meaning any of us who are involved in therapeutic work, all right, wherever we are, but where we live in groups to try to achieve something better for individuals, all right, and improve our societal kind of well-being. So that's what I'm going to try and talk about, and as I say, there's going to be a conversation at the end. There's a long list there, you see, and it's quite difficult if you look at the list. Just perhaps listen to me run the list is usually the easiest thing, I think. Just to say, my background is social work, social therapy for children, residential work, a Jungian analyst, manager, commissioner, policymaker, Department of Health and Ministry of Justice. And my work, fundamentally, I realise now, I look at John Diamond here, who was around when I was young and we worked at a therapeutic community for children. My work's fundamentally not altered. It's been about trying to help young people, first of all, and then adults move from feeling disabled in their lives by their ability to relate in the world and the way the world relates to them. Is it a satisfactory relationship? Does it work, or is it pervasive and problematic? All right. I've been trying to work on that with young people and adults all my life in one form or another. All right. Trying to provide better services, learn about it more. And I have to say at the end of it, there's still a hell of a lot that we don't know. right? And you in this room probably know as much as many people because you're engaged, many of you, either in providing therapeutic environments or actually living in them and participating in them. And that should never be underestimated, that that's an important area of continued research and inquiry. What goes on in these worlds that you live in, all right? I think the next thing I'd say is the other contextual thing is the biopsychosocial model. That's a big mouthful, that, isn't it? But that's come into being over the last few years a lot more. Gone is the idea of a medical model of mental health only. Psychiatry has altered the way in which it thinks about things, the same as social care has started to appreciate that there's something more than just care. So the biopsychosocial model has become bigger. But actually the other concern is mental health, the wider mental health field, as you probably know, and I'm very sad to hear the Carlisle, is that the Carlisle's TC? Is that the one up at... it is, yes, which I think commissioned from our programme many years ago, about 12 years ago, I think. So I'm very sorry to hear that's closing, and in a way I was there at the time when the Henderson closed, all of which in their way have very, very poignant and profound impacts on both the people participating, but on the field of therapeutic work, because it makes one feel, God, is there any hope? You know, is it really no good, or is it just things just end? Do they just go cycles? But I have to say, look at this room. If you'd looked in this room, if you'd called a meeting like this in 1968, you wouldn't have had many people, right? There wouldn't have been many people. They'd primarily have been perhaps Grendon, perhaps, well, with Henderson, Grendon, there would have been a few children's communities, right? Pepper Harrow, Cotswolds, places like that. So there is something that's growing, and we should be optimistic about that, I think. But nonetheless, the policy field is going in a different direction, which you've talked about a bit this morning. Is it going to become more industrial? Is it going to become a more just standards-based for the purpose of performance rather than the purpose of quality and reassurance? So that's important too. There's something about that industrialised approach that means that commissioning and delivery can be dangers there. It's not just commissioners who fail in understanding a complex process like therapeutic work. It's actually therapeutic environments themselves could get very caught up in starting to try and identify that in some way you can quantify everything you do, you can describe everything you can do, you can know everything you do in a therapeutic environment, and that's actually simply not the case. A lot of it we can do, standard setting, criteria, work, research clarities, these things are all vitally important because the evidence base is still weaker than we would want it to be in time. But we must not forget that at the heart of much of what therapeutic work is about, and certainly psychoanalytically informed, psychologically informed, is that it's a complex biopsychosocial matter involving individuals and groups and society in a way that makes it very difficult to imagine when we'll ever come to a point where we say, we've cracked it, we know exactly how all this goes now, all right? And we shouldn't believe we should simply relish and challenge and champion standing up for the not knowing bit as well as the knowing bit. All right, that's quite important, I think. And I say that knowing it's people like me that have been responsible for having to, in the end, sign off the closure of some things too. All right, so I do know the difficult end of that. It's more that, in a sense, if we don't face that and stick up for these things, then obviously they will die. We'll give up on it. And I know that's easier for me to say than probably those of you who are directly involved to do currently. I think there's a whole new importance to the client-staff relationship, of which play will have an important part. There's something also about the fact we've begun to recognise we damn well don't always train staff to do the job. Well, I have to say, my last few years at work, working with the prison service and therapeutic environments, I have to say I'm very encouraged that you can take people who wouldn't themselves have called themselves therapists, who wouldn't have thought of themselves as running a therapeutic regime, but who run excellent and very innovative services around some of the work that's been done with the offender PD work. So I'm positive that I think you provide staff with the right capabilities, skills and support, and you'll damn well get a good job. All right? Not always, but you generally will, and that's worth investing in. And then there's the whole opportunity that I particularly see currently, I suppose, and I would do, for in spite of the prison service being stripped to the bone in terms of money, it's a time when it's got some of the most and largest therapeutic developments going on in the country. All right? And that should tell us something. I don't mean you can do it without money, but you can target money, particularly if it's joint money from health and from criminal justice, to be able to make sure that services that are more appropriate to people, more effective, can be put in place. I'm going to say something about play now, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the end about things. So I've only done 3 quotes about theory. We could spend several weeks seminars on therapeutic play, or play as it relates to therapeutic change, all right? So I've just chosen 3 quotes, and I'm going to give you 2 poetry quotes after it, but 3 quotes from theorists who've written in the field about play. I think most people will have an idea, they've heard the names. Melanie Klein said the following: a process that is, this she's talking about play from a psychoanalytic perspective with children, all right? And remember, one of the key things I'm going to say today is how do we move the concept of play into adult therapeutic life, all right? How do we hold it but not make it seem like an infantile or childlike thing? It's actually central to our lives, throughout our lives, but it has to have new languages and it has to have new ways of thinking about it and new ways of providing it too. But she said it's a process that, at one and the same time, an attempt to adapt to reality and an active means of expressing anxiety. So if you just think about that for a minute, an attempt to adapt to reality, get used to the outside world, the otherness, the person other than myself, and to also actively means of expressing what the anxieties in my world might be, and they might be both a wish enactment and also a defense against anxiety. So those are quite complicated concepts, but actually fairly simply put that they're actually about adapting to reality and dealing with anxiety, okay? Those two things which we all know. I think we all know about reality and we all know about anxiety. So the second one is from W.D. Winnicott. It's not a quote, but he had these two concepts of the transitional space and the intermediate area. That was what he talked about. Most people will know about the mother and baby idea of the nursing mother that Donald Winnicott talked about. He was, again, an analyst who worked with children. And he actually developed the whole idea that what was vital was what went on between the parent and the child at those critical stages early on, because all sorts of important, symbolic, cultural, understanding and emotional matters went on in those little spaces between me and not me and mum and baby and all the things. And he once said, there's no such thing as a nursing mother. He was talking about mothers, this was the 50s, meaning there's when a baby's small, it isn't a separate, like go back to my picture, it is not a separate individual. It is actually mum and infant are one for a period of time. Then you could say parent and infant. And then the final one is Schwartz-Salent's idea of that there's very similar, an interactive field, all right? The idea that there's a third area in our lives that's between me and you. When we are together, two of us, there is a space in the middle that is both about our conscious and unconscious life, and it's about combined subjectivities. We both bring both our conscious and unconscious lives into this middle space in the middle, okay? Now, that's all the theory we're going to do this morning, all right? But just hold on to those three. It's about, at the heart of all of those is what's going on between us. What's going on between the therapeutic community staff and the environment and the clients and residents. What's going on in the spaces between us. Every day when we meet in a therapeutic environment, we meet across a space. Now that space can be used much more effectively, but it certainly needs to be recognized and understood very clearly if we're to make use of the environment we live in. And that's where we come on to play as an art form, all right? I'm going to read you these two quotes, then that's no more quotes for today, okay? We'll just talk a bit more. What artistic work and child's play have in common, all right? Both at their fullest are experiences of being lost in the present and entirely occupied. I'd never thought of it as that way, but I think that's a very interesting idea, that we can be lost in the present and entirely occupied. It takes a very anxiety-free state to be able to do that. You have to be able to tolerate letting yourself go and being participant with yourself totally preoccupied, but being here now rather than just in your head and in fantasy. So that's one, and that's by Mike Doughty. What one seems to want in art, and I'm comparing the two because I think they're both very playful activities. Art is a very playful activity, potentially. What one seems to want in art, in experiencing it, is the same thing that's necessary for its creation, a self-forgetting, perfectly useless concentration. By useless, she means it does have no purpose other than itself, to create, to do something. So when we're small and we're playing, it is a useless, other than to us activity. The concentration is to actually be in the present, to be entirely occupied with our world as we're experiencing it in relation to the world outside of us. Our imaginings, our testings out of how the world works, our role-playing, our exchanges with other people, our angry and difficult and loving feelings, all of these things go in across that space and are quite often learnt early on as play. And in adult life, I argue, still go on, but we just don't call them play anymore, and we often cover them up with other things. We need to be more honest about the play in our adult lives. Right. people have heard of PIPES, I think, PIEs, psychologically informed environments. You've heard a lot this morning about environments from Sarah and earlier, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how in the environment, what might be important about play. But I want to do that by, first of all, emphasizing this thing about environment. We've got, over the last 40 years, we've moved to a place where treatment is in danger in the health and criminal justice services and social care. Treatment things are danger of becoming very prescribed, all right? And they tend to ignore the surrounding conditions. Now, TCs are not that, all right? TCs are very good at usually recognizing environments, but actually, in a lot of parts of the world, we quantify it into little things that are done to you. You go to the health service, you get a package, you get so many sessions of this, or you get this intervention. And ignoring, as we've learned to our error in the health service, ignoring all the surrounding things about the person is a real person in an environment and alive and here now. And whatever you're doing for them, you might damage all that by the way in which you treat them in other ways in that process. So if you look at North Staff's Hospital, the chaos there was really about failing to notice that real people were living in a hospital with real needs. And actually, that's increasingly the case, that we need to kind of recognise that that facilitating health is to have an environment that facilitates it and getting that right. Now, the enabling environments work that you heard about, TCs, PIEs and PIPES, I want to say something about what they are and actually about whether or not, what might be the criteria we would say make play quite important. First of all, they're 24/7 environments, or need to be. They're places where we need to think of humans living 24/7 lives, and actually, therefore, we take every opportunity to participate in play activities. There's a centrality about the relational consistency that you need and meaningful exchange. When you meet somebody across a room or in an exchange, there's a great potential in that moment that you and they will be able to share something, learn something, however difficult, in the exchange that goes on between you and how you manage that. There is, at that moment, something about sharing internal and external realities. The idea that we both live in our own worlds, in our minds, our hearts, our heads, but we also live in our external worlds where we every day have to do business. We have to kind of exchange with people. We have feelings about them. They have feelings about us. We have reactions to them. All of the time, we're having to negotiate that. And it's important that play is one of the areas, I think, that for children, a lot of that is learnt and worked out. But that actually for us as adults, we tend to get into more difficulty sometimes because we don't have a recognized conscious process through which we do it. You do in a TC because you have lots of structural and process activities which help you do it. But actually, this needs to be the case in any environment, and it needs to be the case in our worlds, that we learn how we're going to get that consistency, how we're going to negotiate the realities of how we feel inside and how the world is adapting or not adapting to us. And it can't be, unless that's done properly, then there isn't learning. Children learn through that testing of reality and that engaging in negotiating their emotional life with the world. They learn about it and adjust in a way that actually enables them to be able to then manage some of the rigors and the difficulties of being a separate person in a social world where you're having to deal with other people. Now, a bit more to TCs. In the offender PD program, we started PIPES, and we realized that, and there are people, is there anybody here from a PIPE in a prison? Only from TCs in a prison, I think, probably. Nice to see people from prisons here, though. Good, very good. And, but one of the things we registered about 2 or 3 years ago was that there was no free activity going on that enabled people to kind of develop this cultural sense of kind of, I'm in my world and I can play with my world. I can play with the world out there. I can engage with others other than through words and talking, which often, for people who are not used to psychological talk, is quite difficult. So we introduced 3 things, which we called enrichment projects. One was being read to. So we had the reader program from Liverpool, went around the country to prisons. They were already in hospitals and places like that. And I heard somebody mention a reader earlier, didn't I? David, did you? No, somebody did. Mentioned having a reader, somebody did. Yes, I did. Sorry. Yes, a reader. And very bad if the reader can't be heard. I have to say, have a word with the reader. But the idea was, it started very simply. I think I was thinking that you'll know if you've worked in a children's community. You'll know if you've got children that children and the reading to activity can be a vitally helpful process, all right? It helps process narrative, it helps talk through bits of the day, it creates symbols internally for the way in which we handle our story of our life, all of those things. And from that point of view, we realized that many of the men and women in prison had never had the experience of being read to, ever, right? Now, this wasn't about literacy. It's not about learning to read. Nobody had to read, but they had a reader come to read very particular texts and stories and then allow a small group of people to just either listen or talk about those things. And what started to turn up was all sorts of really interesting stuff about people suddenly found a voice to things they hadn't previously because they got a narrative over there, a story, a poem, that in some way allowed them to see that it wasn't only their narrative, it was others, and that there was a connection between them and other people. So we did reading too, and that's now running quite successfully in, I think, about 12 prisons, and in other places, obviously a lot more around the country, like social care. Some very good work with people, older people with Alzheimer's, for whom language, organised language, is quite difficult. But you read them a poem, a sonnet, or something, and before you know who you are, they're all engaged in a discussion about what it makes them think about, and actually allowing them to connect to a world they've really nearly lost. The second one was singing together, all right? We realised that for many of us, when we're small, the early stage is the kind of call and response of our lives when we're saying, we go, ooh, ah, and mother goes, ooh, ah, and there's a backwards and forwards, which later, when we become adults, becomes how do we manage the exchange of talking? Do we run over each other? Do we listen to each other? Do we genuinely respond to what the person said, or do we just say what's coming to our mind that we want to say? These are things that we learn as skills, but also as very satisfying experiences. If we get a good relationship where call and response, where we're generally sharing well what we want to say together, that's a very positive experience. But we realize that for many, again, men and women in our prisons, they've not had anything like that experience and found it very difficult talking. So we sent singing teams in, and they didn't run choirs. They simply ran singing workshops, right, where people would come, as they came voluntarily, and they would sing. And some of the responses were quite startling. People who'd never, ever talked about anything, never participated in anything willingly in the prison, suddenly participated in the singing workshop. And there was an enormous sense that in another form, which I might call another play form, there was a chance to connect the person up and to build a relationship around that simple activity of singing. And then the final thing was a bit more doubtful. We didn't do art, by the way, mainly because art's very established as an art activity in prisons, but also art therapy has a place that's already kind of quite strong. So we didn't think it was the first place to start. They'll be interested whether people think art is another area, most definitely, where play goes on, and certainly this is with children. But we did theatre, and what we did is we wanted narrative making, story making. So we got theatre groups to go. And they didn't do plays, and there was no performance. But what they did is they get the men and the women to write a play or a drama, usually based on their lives they wanted, didn't have to be. They wrote the script, and then they enacted it to each other, right? So what it was about narrative making, which again, in play, in childhood, narrative making, children tell you the story of their lives through the play they're having. And they'll often have all sorts of symbolic qualities to them. It doesn't have to be up front. They'll tell you about all their fears and anxieties through the story they tell, the drama they make out of play. And we believe there's something very important about that. You will probably tell me you already do some of these things, maybe in some of the TCs that you come from. But these are things that make the basis of potentially finding a whole day long. They don't have to be formal activities like singing or whatever. There is play activity going on, but they have these different forms like short exchanges, like the use of humour, like little tiny kind of toings and froings that go on between us. And in them lies something very important about the idea of can we have a different form of relationship? It isn't just about talking to each other or agreeing meetings or deciding on events or, they're actually simply spontaneous, and I might call loving activities, right? They're genuinely spontaneous and naturalized if they're done well, right? There's two other things to say about that, and that's just that sometimes we just remember that the biggest importance in a therapeutic environment is, in fact, sometimes not only do you have to always be able to stand in the shoes of other people if you're trying to understand them, if you're trying to think what do they feel like and why, but you also have to sometimes just stand by. Margot Riddell once said that one of the great acts of therapeutic and psychoanalytic work was this role of standing by, being have the person in mind, think about them, and actually do no more than that. And actually, just the two prison officers, I think one of the prisons we started a pipe in, said to me one time, we have terrible trouble with the men in the morning. When you unlock the door, they swear and shout, and it's always a difficult time of day. So we were talking about this, and I said, well, maybe, to two of them, I said, maybe when you go and open a cell door, put the key in, but don't unlock the door until you've spent 30 seconds thinking about the man on the other side. Okay? Then unlock the door. I was back there 6 or 9 months later, and one of these men came up to me and said, you know, you said about that and the door. He said, you know, it's a curious thing, but we think we've got better mornings now. Meaning that if staff open doors with more thoughtfulness, then maybe men come out of being locked up. If you think about what it's like to be locked up for 12 hours in a cell, you're going to be more aware of maybe what it feels like when you come out. Therefore, your way you respond is as important as the way they respond. And so you get this, again, a relationship between you that is actually more thoughtful, more developed, and actually can lead to, and one of the things they're saying is it's easier to joke now, you know, because there's a more relaxed approach to the start of a day. So the last slide on these. Just I put up there just about playing with, all these things, but I look at was playing with, playing about, playful, playing to, playing up, playing alone, shared play. There's all kinds of plays in our social life, you know, actually that we do. You know, some of them are negatives, you know, playing up, a child plays up. Well, actually, children who play up usually are trying to communicate something. They usually try to tell you something. And we know that we would say that of adults too. Oh, he's just playing up, they say. Well, actually, we need to take that seriously because it's a form of trying to communicate in the same way much of play can be or should be. So it's important that we understand it in that way. And I think the other thing is that play needs to be thought not of as a treatment, but as a provision. We used to often say, I think some of the therapeutic communities here, not all of them, will be about what the provision of experience is about rather than what the treatment intervention is itself. It's about providing a long enough period of time for the person to experience a different way of meeting the world, a different set of relationships, a different set of day-to-day responses that they weren't used to. So particularly with children that works, but it can also work with adults where they don't meet the expected response. They meet a different response, a response that's more considered, more thoughtful, more therapeutic and so on. It's very warm in here, isn't it? I can see people are hot, sorry. Play is communication then, very important, both directly about speaking about things in play. That's what play therapy, Virginia Axline and people like that wrote books about play therapy. They're still wonderful reads, although a bit dated. But actually, it's about, more than anything, it's about thinking about that when we play, it's potential to allow people to express things symbolically. They can make a story, they can play a game, they can have an exchange in a playful way that is telling you something seriously. It doesn't always mean to say it should not generally be interpreted, but it should be responded to on both sides by the speaker and the receiver as being understood. So we can say one other thing about play is it must be something that can be understood, and we as workers in the field, as participants in the field, should put our minds to it isn't just play. There's no such thing as just play, I don't think. There will be lone play, hence there will be just playing alone, which is only of interest in many ways to the player. And we need to acknowledge that people need a bit of time to play alone, all right? But actually, generally in play, we should understand it as being an importance, a value, all right, having meaning in it rather than not. And it may not always be clear to see, but it's important that we take it that way. The other thing is that play often is a way of working things through, as we know. It actually means that we work things out. Children work things out in that way, okay? They actually kind of test it out. And I experiment at being, you know, I'm currently putting some slates on a house, so I'm playing at Bob the Builder, really. And the two builders treat me a little bit like I'm a child, you know, so I carry things for them. And they say, now I'll just show you how to put a slate on. So, and you do you know what I mean? And actually I feel myself thinking, well, I'm sure I know how to do, you know. But actually, of course, what they're doing is parenting me in the task, and I'm playing in order to learn in that sense, but actually it needs to be done respectfully. There was one time when one of them said something to me and I thought, well, that's a bit rude, you know, a bit disrespectful, and it put me off learning then. So what we need to do is be respectful to play, right? To be able to make sure it's never demeaned, and we always feel our presentation of our play expression is received in a positive way. And the other thing is this new narrative making. My goodness, we need new narratives, all of us. I mean, if you think of the world we've currently got, it doesn't always have happy narratives in it, does it? It doesn't look good. Here we are in the middle of an election. I can't see a very happy narrative yet about the election. I want one, but I can't. But more seriously, in our real lives, we quite often have very difficult times, and we need to find ways of extending our capacity to take memory and then put new narrative to it with new information. So if we've learned something new from our here and now, we can turn that narrative into a new story about ourselves. And I've heard people like Erwin James, the writer in The Guardian, who was a long-term prisoner in prison, talk about that one of the big differences, the day he realized his narrative about himself had been a denial of the truth of the real story of his life. And once he faced that, he could then start thinking about building a new narrative about how he'd be in the future. So now he's a Guardian journalist rather than a man locked up for murder. So, and that after a long time. But, so new narrative memory making, that idea we're going to build a new memory about ourselves is very important. It's enriched by play. Children enrich that. I have godchildren who still play at 25. One of them's a teacher in London here. The other one's works in as a psychologist, and actually they still play. They come home and play, and they don't play they play card games, but they play sometimes. They simply play. They just have fun, you know, and they. But, you know, and there's laughter and rolling about almost, you know, and then a serious kind of organising of play events, you know, mud rugby or whatever. It's kind of games they play that are really still very, very childlike games in many ways, but translated very positively into adult life. And play should be always felt to be done with rather than done to you, right? Don't ever do play. What we need to do is provide the setting, provide the encouragement, and positively connote the idea that playing is a natural and good thing, a thing that we can feel good about and doesn't have to be a nice, complete, tidy thing or very contained. At times it won't always be contained. It will be something that's simply an enjoyment of our experience. So, my last slide. These are the questions I might leave for your question time, but for you to take into workshops or just take back into your worlds, because I didn't say at the beginning is when we started out on this, I simply couldn't, I was trying to understand from my child work background how play fitted in an adult life in a prison, and I just couldn't see it myself. There was no, I couldn't see how you talk to the prisoner. Michael Spur, the head of the prison service, you know, I would have a conversation with him, but if I started talking to him about, we're going to get them to play, Michael, I don't think he'd be terribly keen. He'd kind of understand, but he wouldn't necessarily see that how would Mr. Grayling like us to be playing in prison. But actually, it's because we need to think about a language and a way of bringing out the capacity for play in all the environments we're in, be they in prison or in the community. So these are my questions, really. How might we speak about the importance of play in an adult world? Just that. How do we actually have conversations like this, or conversations you're having today about play, in such a way that it's felt to be useful, positive, natural, but inquiring? All right, questions that we know we might learn something new of, and actually that's quite important. How can we establish the practice of play in all therapeutic things? By that I mean that all staff and all participants understand that we do value play and will provide experiences for play, one way or another, that are appropriate to adult life. All right, and that's the critical bit, appropriate to adult life. And how do therapeutic communities take a lead on that? You're one of the biggest collections of communities, prescribed communities, who are engaged in psychosocial thinking and psychosocial life. You should be the place that probably one would most look to say, tell us, inquire into how play can be developed. How can it be done with the aims I've described here and maybe others you want to add to it? And how can the daily experience of living together, the learned lived experience, how can it be mined for play potential? How can we look into it? You know, when you're cooking in the kitchen, how is there a play element in that or not? How can we use that? How can we encourage people to actually sort of participate in these activities that we know help us to learn about this internal-external relationship that we have? And can the TCs move from play? We don't want to see play as therapy. We want to see play as just part of day-to-day experience, all right? Not something that it's experience of relating. You know, if my wife would say sadly sometimes, been married for 47 years. But I would say there's an element of what we do that is absolutely moments of great play, you know, where there is a play going on. It may not always be clear quite how it is, but it is. And I think you all would recognise that. And then, what skills do we need for staff and for residents participants? What do we need to know? What do we need to learn? And what environmental changes to our therapeutic environments do we need to make to allow play to be allowable, tolerable, and valued? Right? So to allow it to happen, to tolerate it when not everyone wants to play, and how to value it when it happens. Right? Those are critical questions I don't know answers to at all. And what might the impact of playful or less playful, how might those you know, we have playful or less playful environments. How might they be researched to tell us whether or not this is an important area of human interaction and life or not? Because we only see it as bedded in childhood primarily. We need to move it into its place in adult life and adult development and change. And it may seem like a small task over there that's a bit peripheral and a bit specialist, but actually I would argue it's very central. If many of our human social care and health services and criminal justice services understood the enormous value of being able to have a spontaneous exchange with somebody in which there is an element of my narrative and their narrative meeting in the middle, somewhere coming to some new understanding, but enjoying it along the way and feeling it is in some way feeding our relationship, that's an enormous gain to us. That's something we should not underestimate the value of. And in what we've learned, I think, and I just finished now, what we've learned in all of this is that it's worthwhile. Every small gain is a big step forward, right? It is no good believing the world is suddenly going to develop a great lovingness and for therapeutic work. It is not, right? And mechanization and industrialization and consumerism are going to simply quash a lot of that enthusiasm unless we push that back, right? We need to be able to say, we know there are important, valuable things for us and our social group, and the social group is bigger than just our therapeutic community. And I'll stop there for questions.